Hi, I'm Serena. I'm a fourth year medical student at Hong Kong U, and I'm joined with Owen, who is the assistant professor at the NUS Center for Biomedical Ethics. So welcome.
Hi.
Can you tell us a bit about what you usually do at your work?
Yeah, so here at the Center for Biomedical Ethics, we have several different activities. We do teaching and research on various aspects of ethics in biomedicine. This includes research ethics, clinical ethics, health policy, and beyond. In my particular research, I focus especially on the ethics of developing novel biotechnologies.
Right. And I understand that you recently developed a research ethics course for students here at NUS. What is the target audience and what is that kind of basic lesson structure like?
Yeah, so we developed we have several courses actually, I should say, but one particular module that we've helped develop is a module that all the incoming graduate students need to take. It covers research integrity and research ethics, and that's essentially organized, but we provided inputs into some of the case studies and some of the sort of elective subcomponents of that. And also, some of us here at CBME run some of the tutorials for that class. So that's one. That's a course that every graduate student at NUS takes. But we also have a specific, for example, graduate module that's a whole 13-week course, a deep dive into research ethics. Prof. Jerry Menikoff, he runs that course. And then also Jerry helps co-run the Master of Clinical Investigation. There's a research ethics course in that program. And then also for the undergraduates, we even have some teaching on research ethics for them. So we run educational offerings actually at multiple levels when it comes to research ethics.
Right. So are these courses always been here, or is it more of a recent development?
Well, I mean, I've been at NUS for about 10 years, and I would say, yeah, I mean, since I've been here, we have had the graduate module, for example, the 13-week course, but the course where every graduate student takes, that's new. That's a new development. The research integrity, research ethics course is a recent. This year is the first cohort that takes that course.
What is a particular drive or motivation for making this course this year?
Yeah, so it's a school-wide priority. The idea being that research integrity and research ethics is something that is expected of every researcher and therefore every graduate student. I think part of the idea was a series of previous kind of meetings and discussions was the idea that some of the challenges in regards to ethics and integrity can emerge due to inadequate training, and that will vary by subdiscipline and by lab, and some will be more on top of ensuring ethics and integrity compliance and upholding the relevant standards, others not so much. So by having a uniform standard, you can ensure that everyone has a basic education in this area. And the hope is that, at least through that knowledge, in research ethics and research integrity, that their research practice, both in graduate school but also beyond, will be more ethical and more defensible, more responsible. Yeah.
Right. Is there any particular reason why this course is targeted towards graduate students and not younger undergrads or even older, like PhD students?
Well, I mean, these are students, graduate students who, and part of the graduate education compared to undergraduate is you do your own research. You're training for a research career, or even if you don't go into research, maybe you go into industry, you'll at least be doing research as part of your graduate degree. And so it's important that everyone doing that be well versed in research integrity, research ethics standards. Contrast that with undergraduate. Not every undergraduate will necessarily be conducting research or research of the kind that would involve at least the broad base of integrity issues. I mean, some issues are universal, like plagiarism, that is universal, but others, such as human subjects research standards, those are more specific to only some. But yeah, with the graduate students, because these are research degrees, it's more important that they all get that broad-based education.
Right, I see. So what do you think is the most challenging part behind designing this course or implementing it? What is the reception like, teaching it, etc., etc.?
I'm actually clarifying. I'm not one of the main designers. I'm assisting the main designers. I don't want to steal credit for the people that are taking the leadership of the course. But insofar as I've helped provide materials for the course and help run tutorials and so forth, one challenge is these are people from a variety of disciplines, most of whom have not really thought much about ethics or integrity issues before. and they come to it, with a view, where the way they engage with educational materials is very different, right? So if you're involved in ethics research, or ethics education, we have our own PhD students. They're very engaged, right, with these questions. But for folks whose main area of research is primarily scientific, and they see themselves as answering empirical questions, they're not always quite as interested in the ethics side of things. Of course, they're required to take this class,
right.
And so folks, whenever there's a required class, the motivation might also be a little less. So you have to take, basically people have no background in integrity or ethics and work from the beginning, right? So you have to work from the assumption they have no real knowledge in this area, and then bring them up to a standard where they can be expected to at least know what responsible research conduct is and what research ethics standards they need to abide by in their work. Of course, knowledge is one thing and practice is another, and we can't guarantee that they will act with integrity or that they will do the right thing. It's really going to be up to their own character and own judgment in those areas. But at least we'll be giving them the knowledge that they need to know what standards are, to know what, and we give them a bunch of case studies, and what in these case studies and what these scenarios they should be doing, and hopefully they can apply those skills to their practice, to their research.
Right. When you talk about case studies, are you talking about hypothetical cases designed to stimulate, debate or contradictory opinions, or are you talking more about historical cases?
Primarily hypothetical. Primarily, these are cases that are something that, as opposed to historical cases, which are things that happened in the past, but in a different cultural and historical and legal context. These are cases that are the sort of thing that might that some graduate students might encounter. It's typically the kind of scenarios that or people, researchers later in their careers. So the case studies are more contemporaneous in order to be more relevant for the sort of challenges, dilemmas that they might face in their actual, if not everyday life, in their research careers.
Right. So do you involve historical cases at all in these courses, any of these?
In the lecture materials, there is some discussion of the history and the context, but that's a matter of background. So how we got to this stage now with the current regulatory and oversight regimen we have, and there is important historical reasons for that. But primarily, that's for the lecture and the actual, kind of case discussion where we're talking about working through a dilemma. We work with the sort of cases they might encounter, so they have the skills to deal with contemporaneous cases. Yeah.
Right, I see. So what kind of materials or sources do you take reference from in order to design these cases? I've actually talked to someone that uses generative AI for these cases. What do you think about that?
So there's a whole other question there. We do have a sub-elective component on AI ethics, and that question of when it is and is not appropriate to use generative AI is its own thing that we actually investigate and cover. And some people have different views on when it's appropriate and not appropriate. I see some utility, I guess, in generating case studies from Gen AI, but we need to be careful. Because Gen AI has no discernment or judgment. It has no moral perspective. And these are ethics cases. And so we need to be careful that because the AI lacks judgment, that the cases they bring forward might have serious deficits in that regard. So if you're using Gen AI, you have to very seriously check every word and every sentence and every language to make sure that it is appropriate and that it is meeting your learning objectives. Another challenge with Gen AI, though, maybe more recent iterations of it have overcome this. When I've played around and seen about generating case studies, they end up being very generic.
Right.
They end up being very blah, very bland, very uninteresting. Whereas with case studies, so sometimes we can get them from textbooks. We can generate them ourselves from our own experiences, or we have a learning point we want, and we can think of a scenario. Or kind of adapt from conversations we've had with individuals. So it could take a variety of sources. But you want to have something. You want to have a variety of cases. That's one thing. You want to have the same kind of case over and over again. Students will kind of lose interest, and you want to cover a variety of learning points. But you also want them to have contexts that are interesting and unique, and because the context will always affect how we make these judgments. Another thing I sometimes do is when there's a new ethical issue or dilemma that emerges, sometimes we can add that as a case study to be a bit more. That's a bit, you have to be a bit careful because then that's an unsettled area.
Right.
But for a more open discussion where it's unmarked, that can help expand people's horizons and thinking. Whereas with Gen AI, it won't be creative enough typically to identify those understudied areas.
Right. Because my project is more about Unit 731, so if you don't mind me pressing a bit on the use of historical case studies. I do understand that, there is pros and cons with using historical cases. First of all, it's very remarkable. You hear about stories like that and you're like, oh, it instantly remembers that things like this happen. And it kind of gets your message across. But the cons is, first of all, as you said, there's a lot of nuances, cultural context, historical background that might not be as applicable in today's world. Is there any other concerns you have with using these cases in these courses?
Yeah, I mean, another kind of reaction sometimes we get, usually not, students saying this sort of, so to speak, to our faces, but sometimes researchers express this frustration with sort of the research regulation regime and the sort of regulatory hoops they need to go through. IRB applications can be sometimes tedious, or, ICOOC and other kind of bureaucratic requirements. And sometimes they sometimes take these courses, right? And they say, why does research ethics exist? Where does it come from? And these historical atrocities come up, right. And they're like, oh gosh, are you saying I'm a Nazi? Are you saying I'm like an imperial Japanese war criminal, right? I'm just here, doing biomedicine, trying to cure diseases or trying to discover important aspects of human behavior. I'm nothing like those war criminals. And so this regime you've created is way overprotective. Like, okay, admittedly we need to prevent these horrible crimes, but you don't need this incredibly detailed, incredibly onerous regulatory regime to stop that. I'm not. They'll say I'm not a Nazi. I'm not a war criminal. Why are you treating me as such? So that's a reaction I've seen. Again, kind of in pseudo-anonymized format. Maybe online comments of researchers frustrated at some of these regimes. Sometimes in conversations where people are willing to be a little more frank. Right. So that's the sort of challenge that might emerge, a perspective that emerge. I think that perspective is mistaken, but that's if you overemphasize the past atrocities rather than the contemporaneous, more nuanced, more gray area issues, you might give that impression.
I see. Another question I have is there's a lot of issues in research ethics. How do you pick topics that you want to focus more intensely on and topics that you might, slightly more glossed over?
Mm-hmm. It's always a challenge. You only have so much course time and you have to pick and choose topics. And there's two different things. One is the list of topics. The other is the number of topics.
Right.
So just on the number, right, there's this trade-off between breadth and depth. You want to cover more topics, but superficially, or a smaller number of topics, but more deeply. In the sort of intro course for all graduate students, in that trade-off, it probably makes more sense to pick breadth over depth, because this is, again, might be their only exposure to research ethics and research integrity. So they need to be having at least some awareness of all the different areas. And in that context, it makes sense to go for breadth. But then for graduate modules, we typically go for more depth. That's where we have a full 13-week course, 2.5 hours or whatever each week, and small seminar, have 10 or 15 people in a seminar room. And that's where you can really unpack the nuances and the complexities. And usually those modules are more successful when they're more targeted and focused. So it'll depend on the context, whether breadth versus depth. Okay, and then in terms of picking which topics, okay, you have a certain number of sessions and number of topics. So one, again, getting back to the target audience, especially for the course that all graduate students are taking, you're going to want topics that are relevant, i.e. topics that are going to be related to scenarios they might encounter, because these are meant to be useful for this isn't just a theoretical exercise. It's so that they know when they are doing their research, these are the standards, these are the expectations, these are the dilemmas, and how to resolve them. Right. So because of that practical goal for the graduate-wide course, you're going to pick topics. So when you have to choose between topics, you pick the topic that is going to be more common across different disciplines, and more potentially relevant issues that might come up in their practice. Another thing you can look at is look at relevant policies and standards. So you look at integrity standards, and you can look at research ethics regulations, and you can look at where these documents, existing documents, emphasize what they spend the most time on. That's another signal in the institution or in the regulatory regime. These are really important. So, for example, in the regulations in Singapore for human subjects research, consent is this massive component of the law, right? And that's a signal that consent is very central. So you're going to want to cover consent issues whenever you do research ethics. Like a research ethics course that didn't cover consent would be like grossly deficient, actually, in my view. But others, that are more subtle, maybe you could go without. So, for example, right to withdraw from research. So this general right people have, subjects have to, withdraw from research at any time. But it gets relatively little attention because it's a corollary of consent, so it's already kind of implied by the principles of consent. It gets relatively little attention in regulation, so it's not central. It's something that you can kind of very easily put in, and it doesn't have as much impact. So if you have to choose between consent and right to withdraw, you would pick consent, for example.
Is there any particular topics that you personally are very interested in, but you kind of have to force to remove it from the curriculum because of practical concerns? Because I know you have a doctorate degree in philosophy, so you probably are very interested in the more theoretical sort of things. Can you include any of those like ethical theories or models into the course?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the course. I mean, interestingly, some other people, not me, when they did their lectures for the graduate-wide course, they included a bit of philosophical theory. My own view is, and then I run some tutorials, and the people students give presentations, and they're informed by those lectures. I've actually found, even though I'm a philosopher, I love theory, I love that. They're not very well equipped to apply the theory to practice. And that's a really important, it's a difficult skill. You take a PhD just to figure out how to do that. And applied ethics is the applying theory to practice. And it's not obvious. We can give you the theory. And in philosophy, in moral philosophy, the big three, consequentialism, deontology, and virtue theory, this is a common way of understanding moral theory. And then I see in student presentations, and I'm going to go to, here's a case study on plagiarism or something. And let's think about, what would a consequentialist say? What would a deontologist say? What would a virtue ethicist say? And then they move on to their analysis, of what you should do, and it has nothing to do with what all three of these three different people would say. Because their reasons for action are not going to be, I'm a utilitarian, therefore I'm going to do this. In fact, in practice, the best models, the best theoretical frames are frames that don't require any theoretical commitments. Right? Especially almost all of the relevant codes and guidelines, they don't assume one moral theory. They adopt mid-level principlist approaches that everyone, no matter their background, no matter their theoretical perspective, their religious perspective, their political commitments, these are like accessible and justifiable. So for that reason, when students actually do their analysis, they talk about things like autonomy and justice and benefits and harms, right? And this is much more fruitful, right? They can get into the trade-offs and get into the nuances. Whereas saying this is what a utilitarian would do, it doesn't really help much, because we're not going to be saying, the research ethics is built on utilitarianism or deontology. Or even, virtue ethics, there's a little bit more cachet, because you can say what I just mentioned, the virtuous researcher is the best one. That's actually what you want. But as I also just mentioned, we don't inculcate virtue in this class. That's actually out of scope of what we can accomplish. And that's true for virtue ethics. Ethicists agree, because in the methodology of virtue ethics, it's not sitting in a classroom and taking notes. It's actually finding a mentor, a guru, a virtuous individual that you imitate and follow. That's the methodology of many virtue ethicists, not the classroom.
Right. So on that note, I'm wondering, how do you assess students on these courses? Because, as you said, there is different moral values and things that you prioritize. And it's very difficult to assess, this is moral, and this is ethical, and this is not. So what kind of assessment framework do you usually use for these kind of courses? Again,
it will vary by the course. And again, when you have a deeper semester-wide 13-week in-depth course, you can expect more from assessment because you have more time and more depth. So, and one thing I do in the graduate module, 13-week graduate module, is I start out, because even that module actually, people don't all have a background in ethics. And I start out with a very basic introduction, so a very simple framework, an ethical framework. But then as the course goes on, I expect them to be able to ramp up their skills and be able to engage at a deeper, more complex level, one that's not quite so rote, so to speak. So the idea is in that course over time, right, I can expect a leveling up of skills and analytic ability. That's part of the course's goal, actually, is to be able to critically appraise and analyze these case studies and think about a lot of the nuances and the gray areas that are emerging. Contrast that with the graduate-wide module. We have less time and less ability to really ramp that up. So we kind of really just start at a basic, so the cases, we have them present, right, and we mark these presentations. But we're really just doing fairly straightforward cases where, even though there's a lot of gray areas, we pick cases where maybe it's fairly clear if you do a little bit of application of standards and codes and guidelines. It's pretty clear what the answer is. So we were not requiring as much critical appraisal to get a pass mark, for example. Because these are typically pass-fail, we might differentiate between the really sophisticated and the less sophisticated. But even the less sophisticated answers, as long as they correctly apply the relevant standards, they'll get a pass. Whereas in the graduate module, I'm going to be, especially towards the end of the course, if they're just rotely applying guidelines, like, okay, no, that's really not good enough. You need to be applying things more critically and looking at more complex issues. So it depends on the context in that regard. The other question is how you mark. Another thing we do for assessment is class engagement and participation, because it's, as I said, it's hard to get people engaged. So we need to actually provide marks and grades to get them to engage. But we can't be expecting a lot of, as I said, critical or deep engagement, because they don't have those skills, they don't have that training, they don't have that background necessarily. So I would just expect even being willing to speak up and try and make a good faith effort. That's good enough to say someone is engaged meaningfully in a graduate-wide course. But again, in the 13-week deep module, I would be expecting more substantive quality of engagement.
Right. So after your years of involvement as an educator in research ethics, do you see any major shift in, either the course content of these research ethics classes, or, the mentality or the preparedness of the students, or any change in perspective over the years? Because I know research ethics changed a lot over the recent couple of years. There's a lot of advancements.
Well, there's two questions there. So one is how the courses changed. The other is kind of how the students maybe have changed.
Yeah.
So I'll take them one at a time. Yeah, the courses evolved. So I mentioned, we want these courses, especially, for equal for the graduate-wide one, but even for the pure 13-week graduate module, we want these to be practically relevant and responsive to current, issues and dilemmas. So as you have especially new biotechnologies emerging, and this is my area of research, we do look for adapting courses to these emergent trends. So, when I first started, precision medicine was really exploding, right? Genomics, genetics, that sort of research. And so, courses on precision medicine became really, really important. Covering that topic became really important. That's still going on, but that's peaked in terms of interest. Now and then there was a period when data ethics was the big one, and that's still important. Now it's AI ethics. That's obviously right now, and it's dominating everything now. There's massive amounts of grant money and guidelines and interest and political comments, and so AI ethics. You can't. So I had this course that for early on, it was a bioethics course I had. It was like kind of thinking about data ethics and precision medicine and governance and stuff. And then I shifted it to be a data ethics class, and then now it's actually a data and AI ethics class. Right? That's responsive to emergent issues, emergent technologies, emergent priorities. That's relevant to researchers, to scientists, to clinicians, doctors, and so forth. Okay, the second part of your question was about how the students have changed. Right. And they have changed too, but in different ways. And I think over time there has been more challenges in terms of engagement. And I think COVID-19 did change things. There was, of course, when COVID-19 hit, there was a big shift to remote learning, online learning, and both in graduate school and undergraduate, as well as depending on the jurisdiction, primary, secondary school, and so forth, right? And that generation, the Zoomers, the way they engage with education material has changed. And the shift towards online has some benefits, public health, and you have emergency. I guess convenience, that's an advantage. And we still do have some online classes out of convenience. Timing-wise, if people, especially if they're abroad, internationally, you can have international courses more easily. There are big downsides, though. And that's, it's just not the same having a conversation like we're having now versus on Zoom. It's just substantively different. So not just in terms of like the physical, but the way the conversation unfolds, the natural, looking at, the way reacting to people's speech and body language. And it's unnatural in important ways to engage online. Another thing is if you spend a lot of time, in your formative years in this online engagement, which has these limitations, I think that those skills of engagement wane a bit. And your commitment to sort of, engagement wanes. So another thing that's happened, so one is that, I think there's a little bit, I think that led to less kind of less engaged student body. And another is definitely, actually more so for the undergraduate than the graduate, but in the undergraduate, we absolutely have seen a decline in attendance for face-to-face. And increased, demand for more online offerings, which we do shift towards, but we have had recently to implement for the undergrad attendance requirements, because we were getting abysmal attendance when it was sort of living up to your responsibility and your accountability. So now we mark attendance for undergraduate classes because if we don't, people just won't show up. So that's happened, and that's not just in ethics. That's across disciplines actually that we found. So that's a recent shift.
Those are huge challenges that we're also facing for this project because we're doing all of our videos online. So it's a huge question. Try to get engagement, making it interesting for people. I feel like having some interactive components would be nice, but yeah, we're still figuring out how to do that. Thank you for all your time. You gave us very precious opinions, and you shared experience on, educating students on research ethics. I feel like that would be a great help for our project.
I guess one thing I forgot to cover, which is before I talked about the challenge about people thinking they're being called Nazis or imperial war criminals, and how to respond to that. Because I wanted to be clear, I don't find that a persuasive objection to covering history. I don't mean that should defeat the point. I think there is a response to that, right? Which is to understand that yes, this is the historical way these crimes emerged, and this is like the extreme end of what happens when you have a complete lack of ethics and integrity. Right, but that's and that led to these regulatory regimes. But what the current regulatory regimes are doing is picking up in a lot of little areas that are not warranting. When there are little things that people do wrongly, they don't warrant jail time, right? But they cause problems. So the issue of results or data that is falsified or that is is not accurate, is manipulated, right? This is a huge problem in contemporary research, right? As research integrity problem, right? It's not that anyone should necessarily, maybe some people should go to jail, I guess, if it's really bad fraud, but it's not a war crime. It's not at the same level, but it's a problem. It's a problem for the scientific community. It's a problem for knowledge generation, right? It's a problem that we need to address. And that's what some of these new requirements are built around in the research integrity side. In the research ethics side, I sit on an IRB. We almost never, we rarely reject a study. Very rare to actually reject a study. Mostly what we're doing is improving studies, amending, saying change this bit of the consent form, change that methodology to protect subjects better. But we don't want to stop research from happening, okay? And we don't want to throw people in jail. So Singapore has a research ethics regulatory regime that on paper looks very punitive. That's interesting. It has criminal penalties for human biomedical research violations, ethics violations. So if you fail to abide by your protocol, if you deviate from your consent form, or don't get the right signature, or you don't use tissue in the right way, right, that violates the law, criminal penalty attached in the law. Oh, that sounds really bad. That sounds like you're treating us like treating researchers like criminals. But it's important to understand the context in Singapore. Okay, this is the way that Singapore regulations, express that these are serious, these are important, these are considerations that aren't just trivial. But in fact, there's never been a criminal prosecution under the Human Biomedical Research Act in Singapore. There's never even been a fine and a financial penalty under the HBRA in Singapore. Because again, the actual mechanism of enforcement is like every other country. You have institutions, IRBs, that kind of can shut down research. And if ministry gets involved, it's to send like a letter or send a warning or something like that. But the professional self-regulation approach is effective. It's only, but they have the law there just in case it's a safety net in case something really bad happens, that they can show that they have a mechanism for acting on that as a measure of accountability. Yeah, so I don't want to give the impression that we have this regime because we think everyone are being criminals. No, the idea is we treat research ethics and research integrity seriously. And even if it's falling short of criminal activity, we want to improve behavior. And the system that's in place, we have it because we know if we don't have that system in place, that protection of subjects will be weakened, that integrity violations will be more common, that scientific integrity of the projects will be undermined, and public trust will be undermined, which itself undermines the ability of researchers to do the job they want, which is to generate useful and generalizable knowledge.
I completely agree with you. I do not think that was a suitable argument. Obviously we're not accusing people of being horrible war criminals, but the importance for myself, the importance of learning about these examples is knowing that a normal person, a completely normal, not malicious person can be driven to do horrible things under the wrong circumstances. And I feel like as students, it's important to know that it is possible. And one thing that really intrigues me was that there is medical ethics education at that time during these horrible war periods, and medical doctors are learning about ethics. They're just learning about the wrong ethical principles that led them to believe that what they're doing is right. So it completely matters what we teach in ethical education. And I feel like using, atrocious examples kind of serves the purpose of just drilling in that lesson to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I guess the question of what's the best evidence for that, I think that is right, but what's the best evidence for it? And I guess you're very aware, and maybe your students will become very aware, because one of the reactions was after the war crimes of World War II, there was still a thought in the West, okay, those were a bunch of really terrible Nazis and really terrible Imperial Japanese war criminals, right? This is sort of the virtue perspective. They're just really vicious, and the regimes picked these really vicious and evil people, right? And they're not like us. So one reaction even after the war was, this, like after the Nuremberg tribunals and all that, well, that's them. That's not us, right? Because it was not immediate after the wars. The modern regulatory regime didn't emerge from the wars. It emerged later. It emerged later when it became clear that there were serious ethics violations happening, even in the U.S., in the U.K., in other countries that were in the winning side of the war and saw themselves in the moral high ground in the war. That's one thing, is that, well, it's important to say it's not just the war crimes during the war, but also later on there were really bad things, not quite as bad as the war crimes, but still really bad things that were being done historically in these countries. The second piece of evidence that's really important comes from research itself and the very famous Milgram experiments, which I view as one of the most important social psychological experiments in human history. And even though there's ethical objections to it, I think those can be defeated. And like the social value of that study is so massive, even with some ethical concerns, I think it's like well justified. And actually, you can replicate it today, very interestingly. To be careful the way you do it, but there's ways of ethically replicating it today. You cover the Milgram experiments in your course?
We will be.
Good.
We will be doing that.
I think it's very important to do that, because that actually is better evidence than the war crimes of the point you just made. Because the point of that was you take people, average person on the street, not a selected, vicious, fascist stooge, but average person off the street, and you put them in an environment with a guy with a lab coat, and you just very politely and calmly say, please continue, while they progressively instill more and more pain until implicitly someone is dying. That's kind of the implicit background of the case, that you keep on pressing the button and the person is like not responsive, and the implication is maybe they're dead or they're unconscious, right? But a large number of people keep pressing and keep going, right? And that was the big thing, that it's not that there's something really morally deficient about the character of the German or the Japanese people. It was something deficient about the context in which they emerged, where this happened, the institutional setup where, anyone psychologically will be in that position, and that would end up happening. And that also suggests the virtuous ethicists, that's not going to be the big solution, because with the right institution, you can have a population that seems more virtuous, but no, you're going to get very bad actors when you have the improper institutional setup. So you need to have an institutional setup that will not do any of those things. You need to have legal protections. You need to have regulatory protections that restrict those behaviors, so that's how you prevent these things from happening. And it also just shows, I think, the way we are all susceptible to these influences. Now, there's questions about, then you go back and think about the war criminals and how to judge them, and that's a challenge. One interesting thing was one of the Nazi war criminals, Eichmann, who was tried, there was a trial in Israel many years later, after Israel found him and prosecuted him. Ultimately, he was executed. And there's a very famous book by a social philosopher, Hannah Arendt, and
I read her book.
Oh, you've read it. Okay, so you know all about this, and it's important. I think it's important to quote that as well, because one of the things he said, he saw himself as like upholding Kant's moral doctrine.
Yeah.
Right. That was like this. He didn't see himself as, I'm out there to like a mustache twirling Marvel villain. Yeah. He's doing really horrible, evil things, but not because human suffering is great and I want to kill off as many people. No, he saw himself as. So I was mentioning the three principles. He saw himself as one of those three, Kantian, upholding a universalizable doctrine. Right, and that was his subjective view. Right, obviously it was completely corrupt and debased, but that was his view. Right, so you can't say, just the moral theory that'll get us there. No, you need to have a system in place to prevent these bad things from happening. You need to have rule of law, well justified, careful regulations, and systems and institutions in place where these are. And that's why so people complain about regulations, but you need these things. You can't rely on individual virtue. You can't rely on moral theory. You need these things to ensure the right protection. And that doesn't mean that regulations can't be wrong. You might have overprotection. You might have laws that go too far. And that there's always questions about where to draw the line and the balance. And I don't want to say, every regulation is self-justifiable that way. We can have a conversation about some IRBs might get overbearing in some contexts, and that's fine to talk about. But we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And we should understand that we need to have some degree of oversight, and we need to have some degree of bureaucracy to keep everyone in line.
I think you just outlined our project in a very concise manner, because we were planning to cover 731 as a starting point, and then we're going to mention some historical examples, so it's not just war examples. So like we're going to cover the Milgram experiment, and then also the Tuskegee and all that, and then we're going to move on to regulations. So we talked about the Declaration of Helsinki, we talked about IRBs, so that's kind of the general flow of things.
One thing I suggest you don't go into, or if you do go into it only as a matter of dismissal. I used to be taught the Stanford prison experiments routinely in the same breath as Milgram. They are not reliable. There is a lot of evidence there was bad research integrity in that study. Compared to Milgram, actually pretty well run. The Stanford research experiment, both unethical but also unreliable scientifically. There was a lot of manipulation of the data or the way the environment was done. So you can mention that that was probably a very poorly run study, and there's research integrity violations there, and there's a lot of reporting and subsequent interviews. The guy who ran that recently passed away, and he defended it at the end, but I think that it's not a good piece of evidence. So
we'll keep that in mind. Yeah. All right. Okay.
But the Milgram experiment is still good.
Right. I think that's a very remarkable signature example in research ethics, research history.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. It's been a great interview.
Thank you.
Yeah.